Hey up everyone, and welcome back to the second mission of the US campaign in Combat Mission Black Sea, where, despite blunting the Russian spearhead driving for Kiev in my zone, some elements of the 20th Motor Rifle Regiment have got them into the suburbs of a town called Bielotserka, which I can't pronounce. Ivan's fragmented, he's under strength, he's been hit by airstrikes all morning, but he's got some forward observers set up in this apartment complex, and my mission is to get rid of them before they start laser designating the NATO forces massing around the town. Obviously, we don't want our forces to get broken up and worn down by enemy fires before reaching the front, so those observation posts have to go. An added complication is that this area is full of Ukrainian civilians who've been instructed to shelter in place, and I have some pretty strict orders to minimise collateral damage, especially to all of these marked buildings. Another additional task on top of the usual requirement to kill as many enemies as possible and take as few casualties as possible is to recce these checkpoints on the right hand side of the map to make sure that NATO forces can get on with using this highway. The briefing doesn't have a lot of information about enemy forces, except that I should expect to find tanks and infantry fighting vehicles despite the NATO air attacks, and that the radar from a Tunguska AA vehicle has been picked up in the area. Judging from the number of burning wrecks on the battlefield and the fact that the Russians generally organise their platoons into threes, I can kind of guesstimate that there's at least the remnants of one company out there and probably more. It depends a lot on how effective the Air Force and the Apaches have been. I, on the other hand, have a pretty small force to use here. Apparently most of the battalion is cordoning off the general area, and I have an urban assault team consisting of 2 Abrams and a Bradley platoon, who are going to get reinforced pretty soon by some engineers and breach teams and a striker infantry platoon. It's a smaller force than it should be because the Bradley platoon is the same one that tackled the government complex in the last mission, so half of them are charred corpses still stuck in the back of their burnt out Bradleys on the last map. But if this is supposed to be a reasonably sized urban assault team for this area, and the predicted enemy forces given the intelligence picture one level up that I'm not getting, it kinda leads me to think that I'm not up against a huge Russian force here. So how am I going to go about this? This is some really atrocious terrain to attack into. You've basically got open ground dominated by a lot of very big, strongly built, multi-story buildings. But I've an hour and a half to do this in, plus a little bit of variable extra time, so I'm going to pretty much treat this as a rolling reconnaissance task. I'm going to move my infantry up nice and carefully, concertina my way up the map, always moving up with the fire support, standing by if I need it, find the enemy, and then tackle him with the vehicles or artillery. Obviously, I'm going to be seeing how it goes, and I'm going to be adapting on the intelligence picture that I developed through my own reconnaissance, but I want to treat this as a slow and steady exercise in destroying the enemy with minimum risk, not some kind of balls out urban assault. It might not quite look that way after the intro where my snipers blew a Russian scout team away, but that's the plan. In fact, that engagement pretty much sums up how I want this mission to go. Find the enemy and kill him before he knows what's going on. Like I said, I am expecting to run into enemy tanks and infantry fighting vehicles here, like this BMP-3 for example, and this would be a great time to show it the Javelin, if I hadn't forgotten to load my pixel tripping up at the start of the game. The Javelins are all still in the Bradleys, but that's a BMP equipped with the Arena Active Protection System, which may or may not be able to protect the thing by shooting down incoming missiles. It might not be able to intercept a Javelin because of the Javelin's top-down attack profile, but while I'm sorting my life out and fumbling about trying to re-equip my squads with Javelins, I'm calling in some precision 120mm mortar fire onto that BMP. Calling artillery or mortars onto armoured vehicles is honestly not something I've ever really done before in combat mission. I've always seen artillery as a suppression and anti-infantry tool. Sure, I've seen the occasional shell or bomb hit a vehicle and do it nasty, but it's not a result I would specifically go after most of the time. Here though, I don't have the Javelin to hand because I'm an idiot. The Abrams aren't in position to take the target out, and actually I'm going to be restricted in the enemy positions I can actually arty because of all those civilians, so let's try calling in a precision mortar strike. Of course the fire mission just misses, and a T-72 gets spotted nearby, so I really need to just get the Javelin teams out there. It doesn't help that I'm really low on manpower after the last mission. I'm pretty much having to pick between having scout and anti-tank teams, but some reinforcements have just arrived in the form of some engineers and breach teams, who have been casually promoted to the scouts, and their Bradleys have been confiscated by my infantry so they can get their filthy paws on the javelins inside. There is also definitely a Tunguska AA vehicle hanging around. I can see it in the distance having a go at my little Raven drone that I've got flying around. I'm not 100% sure if it can actually hit the drone. I know that some of the AA platforms can't take down some of the smaller drones, and the Raven drone is pretty small, so I'm hoping it's going to get away with it and be okay. In the next turn, I get a platoon of striker infantry who pop in on the far right of the map. There are the 2 checkpoint objectives to take over there, the 2 places I got to recce, but they're way down my priority list compared to the enemy OPs on the left, and that's without factoring in that I don't want to split my force into 2 poorly supporting groups. If the strikers push down this highway towards the CPs, which is probably a bad idea just based on the ground, then my main force in the centre can't support them and vice versa. Plus, to be a bit gamey and cynical, that striker infantry has been attached from another unit, and it doesn't form part of my force's core TOE for the campaign, which is a fancy way of saying that they're comparatively expendable, and I want them up front doing the dangerous stuff instead of the troops I'm going to be taking from battle to battle. So the strikers are going to be moving left across the highway into this dead ground here before crossing this open danger area once I've recce'd it and made it safe. Then that striker platoon can take the lead in the centre. In the meantime, I finally managed to get a javelin team into position to take out the T-72 on the left, when I get an infantry spot in the church just in front of my positions. The Russians are engaged pretty quickly and they escape into the back of the church, which isn't fantastic because they're still in my way and I'm going to have to clear them out at some point. Just to complicate things, it turns out the Tunguska can shoot down the Raven drone, so that's gone. And I was worried about an explosion behind the Abrams, thinking it was a spotting round and I might have to start moving them, but in hindsight it's obviously the drone crashing back down to earth. So, a lot less worrying than the possibility of incoming artillery, but still, you've got to wonder what would happen if it landed on someone. All this time, I'm slowly edging my way forward, which I don't like because I'm already feeling like I'm going too slow. And I am going really slowly here, but I'm doing my best to be patient. I've spotted an IFV of some kind covering the road the strikers are going to have to cross, and I've got that Russian team in the church to bear in mind. So I have to keep telling myself that I have really legitimate reasons for going slow here. The question is whether I've decided on a plan that's going to take too long. If I'd gone balls out on the left, stacked the Bradley platoon, or what's left of it, with the Abrams and then pushed across the open fields, then I'd be much further up the map by now. But I'd also be exposed to all of these windows with potential RPG or ATGM teams, Russian tanks or BMPs in defilade behind the buildings, or close-up enemy tanks in the dead ground in my path, like the T-72 I just whacked. And of course, the other flank is just as bad, with the extra spice of having to fight across the apartment complex from right to left to reach the vital OP objectives. Going slow and steady up the middle with the sort of creeping reconnaissance strike thing I've got going on isn't a good option either, especially given my limited manpower and the amount of floor space ahead of me, but at the same time I reckon this is the only way I can mount some effective reconnaissance and get a handle on the situation before committing. At the moment I have a pretty restricted picture, but once I get a little bit further forward and get some observers up in these buildings to eyeball the square, then I think this approach is going to start to pay off. And if it doesn't, then this way at least I've got the flexibility to change tack if I need to. I'm trying to minimise the number of pixel tripping I have at risk, and I'm keeping my transport vehicles, the Bradleys, at the back out of trouble. Tactical deliberations aside, and trust me, this approach gave me lots of time to mull absolutely everything over, my infantry have spotted another BMP-3, this time down in the centre, and while I'm trying to get a javelin team in position, I've decided to give the 120mm mortar precision fire mission another chance. This time, a couple of turns later, it works, and the left-hand BMP gets nailed through the top armour, leading to a catastrophic autoloader detonation. The turret crew of that BMP can give their thoughts on the autoloader versus manual loader debate to the astronauts on the International Space Station as they fly past. The precision fires aren't 100% reliable here though. The strike on the new centre BMP-3 fails to hit, but whether or not the shock and fragments from near misses like that would actually knock out or cripple some lightly armoured vehicles like BMPs is a good question, but it hasn't here, so I've got to bring that javelin to bear. I'm also sneaking a javelin team from the striker platoon up to try and spot and engage what I think is another BMP on this road here, but funnily enough, walking straight into its field of fire doesn't go well. Total hats off to the crazy brave Pixeltruppen who carries on aiming the javelin after being wounded by a 100mm high explosive airburst. But crazy bravery doesn't protect you from 30mm cannon shells or your commander's incompetence. That was a dumb mistake and a half. But realistically, it's not that big a problem. I'm still gradually pushing up in the centre and eventually I'm going to find a position to hit that BMP from the flank. Not that that is as easy as it sounds. One of my scouting breach teams is lit up by flanking fire from the church just as it crosses this little square. I'm able to shut Ivan down pretty quickly with all the supporting forces, a minor triumph for the slow and steady concertina, but the little buggers slink away again. I've got to go and get rid of them before they cause any more trouble, and I'm reluctant to send in one of the understrength Bradley squads, but they're pretty much my only option, so off they go. They've got plenty of support, Abrams, Bradleys, snipers and fellow Pixeltruppen included, but knife fight ranges with assault rifles are always going to cause casualties. 2 of my guys go down, everyone in the building panics, but that supporting fire comes in and the Russians eventually break and run, only to be taken out in the open. So that could have gone better, but it could have gone a lot worse too. Clearing buildings is almost always going to be a high casualty exercise no matter how you do it. Maybe I could have just flattened the building with the Abrams or the artillery. It's not one that I've got to preserve, but I feel that that would probably have taken too long. Anyway, I'm back on track now and I'm launching a javelin at the centre BMP only for it to miss. So, sorry to the unfortunate Ukrainian family sheltering in the flat that just had £250,000 worth of missile hit it, but I've never seen the javelin miss in Black Sea before. That is an Arena BMP-3, so maybe it also has some kind of jamming equipment on board that fritzed out the missile, spoofed it off target. It might be more likely that the thing just malfunctioned. But either way, it works second time round and that BMP gets nailed. Seriously, it's never going to get old watching the javelin do its thing. Clearing out the churches let me get another javelin team up onto the roof of this apartment block here where they can get eyes on that BMP-3 on the right. The BMP spots the launch, but by then it's too late. That provokes some Russian infantry to open up on the striker platoon. It's an interesting life choice, especially seeing as though Ivan doesn't manage to actually hit anything and ends up getting badly shot up in return. And that's pretty much cleared up the danger area separating the strikers from my main force, so I can start moving them across. I'm still being careful about it, I'm still keeping one foot on the ground, and I'm making sure to get the 2 casualties from that javelin team some immediate aid. That way, it's going to increase their chances of being wounded casualties at the end, and decrease their chances of being dead casualties at the end. And that's going to look good back home, and it's going to look good on the scoreboard. Now that I've got the strikers across, I've started creeping into block 15. It's a little risky because if my breach team scouts here run into trouble, it's going to be very difficult for me to support them. But if they do run into any problems, they should hopefully be able to run away fairly successfully. And they can't see anything. That doesn't mean much. Buildings are very good concealment for infantry, and there could be Russian armoured vehicles tucked away in places the breach team doesn't have line of sight to. But it does mean that it's relatively safe, and I can start moving my infantry into the apartments to expand my spotting ability and build up the numbers for a potential base of fire. It doesn't take long until they spot a modernised T-90, a T-90M, behind the next block. So off goes a striker full of infantry. They're going to move into position to javelin the thing, and as they're moving up, I spot the Tunguska finally. This means that things are a little more complicated. Both the T-90M and the Tunguska have pretty good optics, and I have to recognise the potential they have to spot a javelin launch and retaliate. Both of those vehicles can put some serious fire out, and the best way to minimise that is going to be to hit both of them at the same time, to do a double anti-armour ambush with 2 javelin teams. Unfortunately, my little Pixeltruppen morons have different ideas. Before my second javelin team has gotten into position, the first one decides that the Tunguska just has to go right now. regardless of my orders to hold fire. The Tunguska explodes, of course, but a firefight breaks out as Russian infantry concealed around the edge of the square open fire. I don't want to take any more chances with random disregard for fire discipline, so I just give all of my forward forces the green light to return fire. And this is actually pretty good. I'm able to quickly gain fire superiority over all these Russian teams, and I've discovered the general gist of the Russian positions around the square, which is going to feed into my decision making. The Javelin team up front decides that actually the T-90 in the distance is less of a threat than some Russian infantry and waits a perfectly good Javelin missile on an infantry target, but luckily the T-90 is apparently blissfully unaware of all this, and my Pixel Schuppen are smart enough to eventually use their last Javelin missile to take it out. Now that I have a reasonably good handle on Ivan's setup in the immediate area, I'm leaning towards focusing left and exploiting the fire support from my new positions in Block 15 and the Abrams on the far left to move up through Block 10 in order to close in on the enemy OPs. There are Russian troops in the last building in that block, and I'd like to drop some artillery on it, but it is a marked building, which means it's full of sheltering civilians, so I have to preserve that building as much as I can. As I'm coming to this conclusion, an AGS-30 opens up from across the square. Automatic grenade launchers are a serious threat to infantry, and it does cause a few casualties before my weight of fire forces the grenade launcher team to break and run where the sniper team can pick them off. Overall, the Russians here seem pretty passive. They're waiting for me to come to them, and they're opening fire on their terms, but at the same time they seem to be crumbling pretty quickly whenever I put fire down on them. So I think pushing Block 10 and angling towards the OPs on the left should pay off. I should be able to deal with anything that gets in my way. Better yet, my assaulting infantry can move up behind the other buildings in the block without getting shot up by either Ivan or my own fire support. The Russians are still kicking in the target building here. At one point they fired 2 RPGs at the fire support Bradley behind my Abrams. One rocket is intercepted by the Bradley's active protective system, the other misses, and then the RPG team gets shut down. I do make a serious mistake with my leading engineer team. They end up running around the outside of the building because I didn't check that there was an interior door between the two halves of it. But I get away with it because I've got the fire support backing me up and start blasting mouse holes in that building so the follow-on striker infantry can go through without leaving the building. By now, the Russians in Building 10C have pretty much had enough and they give up. They're all either incapacitated, running away, or trying to surrender, so I can avoid actually storming the building and risking some heavy casualties and simply occupy it to set up the base of fire for the next move forward. And looking at the ground, this move is going to require a different approach. I don't want to try and take the next block of apartments. It's far too big. I've only got about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to go directly for the closest enemy OP. It's probably also too risky for infantry to cross that kind of distance under so many potential enemy firing positions, so what I'm doing is I'm loading the 2 teams of my engineer squad into 2 of the Bradleys on the potentially questionable basis that a quick dart across the gap with maximum fire support is going to result in fewer casualties than slogging across on foot. It's certainly a risk, especially after something similar went disastrously wrong at the government complex in the last mission, but I reckon that I've got enough backup from the Abrams, from my infantry, and a lot of air-bursting 155mm rounds suppressing the enemy to pull it off. So, here we go. Even before the Brads have gotten out the starting gate, an RPG team fires at one of the Abrams. The rocket is intercepted by the Abrams APS, and a firefight kicks off as more Russian infantry open up. None of their fire is aimed at the Bradleys, but one of them runs over a mine and ends up immobilized in the kill zone. The second Bradley makes the cross with no problems though, and the team inside takes the first OP objective. The enemy infantry that's just opened up is very quickly shut down, just like in all of the other engagements. I have got the problem of the Bradley though, stuck in the middle of a minefield. There are no casualties, both the crew and the engineer team inside are totally safe, but I don't want to dismount them because they're in the middle of a minefield. I don't know what kind of mines they are. It could be a mixed minefield. They could get out and start blowing their toes off. But at the same time, they're sitting there, they're a stationary target, they're very exposed. It's a nasty catch-22, but I think that it's going to be safer to sit in the Bradley and wait for the end of the game than it's going to be to get out and wander around in a minefield. I now have literally a minute left on the clock. There is some variable extra time, but it's not something I can count on, and I doubt it's going to be enough to tackle the huge series of apartments blocks up next, even if I didn't have a minefield of unknown size and depth to worry about. So I'm pretty much letting the time run down here. And the end result is a total victory, which I didn't see coming, but I've kept my casualties down to 2 dead and 6 wounded, along with the Raven drone that got shot down. And I've killed 30 Russians, wounded 15, captured 1, and I've destroyed 2 tanks and 4 armoured vehicles, all the while achieving all of my objectives except touching the second enemy observation post and touching the 2 checkpoints over on the far right. So, a success for the agonisingly slow and steady approach. I'll put together another lessons learned video for this one, guys. I'm currently grappling with the next mission, mission 3, which is looking like it's all kinds of interesting and difficult. Really hope you enjoyed this one, guys. I'll catch you in the next video.